Okay, well now let's think about mental illness more specifically. We already talked about biological disturbance. Now the biomedical people like to think that, they're kind of like psychoanalysts in a way. Because the psychoanalysts like to think that if there's something wrong with you, it was in your head. And your head would either be your brain or your psyche, because both of them fit uncomfortably in the same skull. But the point, the thing that makes the psychoanalysts and the biomedical guys similar is that if there is a problem that an individual is manifesting, they tend to localize not only the source of that problem, but the causal pathways that cause the problem inside the individual. And the biomedical people would point to the utility of psychoactive drugs in the treatment of pathology as proof for their hypotheses. But the problem with that, as we'll see later, is that many of the drugs that the psychobiologists use are so non-specific in their effects that they treat things that have nothing to do with the individual, even if they're given to the individual. And we'll see how that can sort itself out later. And if you're thinking about psychological disturbance, well, that makes it complicated too, because you've got a levels of analysis problem, right? I mean, are you talking about disturbance in cognition? Well, then you have to define that. Like, the cognitive behavioralists like to think that the reason people are ill is because they think wrong. Well, that implies that you can think right. That's hard. But it also implies that thought is the primary causal nexus in the relationship between health and illness, and intrapsychically, right? So it's in the person and it's thought-based. So it prioritizes thought to a massive degree, and I don't think that's biologically tenable. I would love it if I could control myself by thinking, but I can't do it, and I doubt like hell any of you can either, even if you're healthy. So cognition is probably privileged too much by cognitive behavioral therapists. There's definitely emotional disturbances. You can think about them biologically, you can think about them functionally, you can think about them at different levels of analysis. There's something key about emotional disturbance to our folk conception of mentally ill. You can have motivational issues. They're linked fairly tightly with emotional problems. I like to think about motivations as goal establishing functions and emotions as goal pursuit regulation functions. It's kind of a heuristic, because there's no firm division between the two categories at a biological level. But people can definitely have problems in what looks like motivation. So manics, they're too motivated. If you watch Charlie Sheen lately, you can see that, because he's manic. And, he's extraordinarily expansive, and he's very, very positive and alert and gregarious and active. But, the calibration is off, and that's not so good. And then depressed people, they lose motivation completely, and that is associated with all sorts of cognitive abnormalities, technically speaking, but that doesn't mean that they cause them. Perceptual aberrations also emerge in psychopathology. You see that with schizophrenia, for example. You also see it with conditions like anorexia, where the anorexics seem to be unable to perceive their own bodies properly. Certain neurological conditions can cause abnormalities in perception as well. And so those are all, even though those categories themselves are problematic because they're basically folk psychology categories, there's no stringent distinction between them biologically, say. But you can see why the diagnostic enterprise is difficult, because each of those different levels of analysis, imprecise as they are, do point to different phenomena. And trying to identify which of those is primary and where the primary dysfunction is exceptionally difficult. Exceptionally difficult. And so, the family systems people localize pathology in the family, and they think about the individual as a unit in a dynamical system that's composed of the family. And I have clients who are nowhere near as insane as their family is, but they're the people who've been targeted with the mental illness, because that's convenient for everyone involved, right? It's really annoying if all 6 of you are crazy, because, you're never going to get out of that. So it's often convenient to identify the noisiest complainer as the psychopathological individual and to, scapegoat them. And then, of course, they look like they're ill too, because they're so bloody stressed that they fall apart in 4 different ways. But the locale of the problem actually isn't in them, even though they're part of the system that's not functioning properly. And even though you can make them feel better by giving them antidepressants, well, at least sometimes, and that's because they have non-specific effects. And then you can think about social disturbance. Let's say you're depressed, and then I find out, well, the reason you're depressed is because you're unemployed, because that's a big deal for depression. Then I found out the reason that you're unemployed, maybe you lost your pension, let's do that instead. That depresses you because you're 65 and now you don't have a pension. And then I find out that the reason you don't have a pension is because, you were a victim along with another 100,000 people of some bloody Enron scam. And then you localize the cause of the pathology in the social corruption that exists in the collusion between high-end crooked business leaders and politicians. And so you're part of that system, and too bad for you. But the causal pathway isn't intrapsychic, again, even though antidepressants might treat it. So level of analysis is a deadly, deadly problem. Then you have this additional problem of the relationship between mental illness and creativity, right, or even of abnormality per se. How do you distinguish someone who's creative from someone who's mad? Well, I don't know exactly, because most creative people produce things that don't work very well and that drive them half mad while they're trying to, market them, let's say, or to get other people to pay attention to them. Creativity is a rough road, and most of the time it's not that good for the person who's engaged in it, even though it might be really interesting to pursue. So here's a tentative partial solution. You can think about this. Mental illness is the inability to regulate perception, action, emotion, cognition in accordance with desired values. Now that's an interesting one because it's half ethical, desired values, and it's sort of half descriptive, inability. Classical conceptions of mental pathology are really predicated on this viewpoint. So, for example, the classical notion of sin is a word derived from another word, hamartia in Greek. Hamartia is sin in Greek, and hamartia means to miss the target. And that's really lovely, because much of what you do see in psychopathology is a form of missing the target. Now, it's complicated because sometimes you see people in therapy who don't have a target. But that's one way of missing it, right? Is you close your eyes, you don't know where it is. Another way is you don't aim at it, right? Another way is you shoot yourself with the arrow, and then get people to feel sorry for you. But it all does have something to do with this notion of not hitting the target. I like this a lot because human beings, we have a hunting biological substructure. We're hunting animals like chimpanzees, and we're really good at tracking moving targets, and we're really good at organizing our behavior in relationship to moving targets. So we can throw rocks at things really well, we can throw spears, and it's on that underlying psychobiological architecture that evolved that our cognitive systems evolved, and our cognitive systems basically track abstract goals that are target-like and aim us at them. And you see this not only in our day-to-day life, where we pursue abstract goals, for example, pursue them, right, which is also what you do with an animal that's running away or a potential mate. You pursue them. Most of our positive emotion is felt in relationship to the pursuit, and the abstracted categories that we use to aim at are targets. And so you could say, in a sense, that mental illness is a consequence of pathology in the goal determination and pursuit systems. And that's a pretty comprehensive one. The advantage to the definition, too, is that it allows the goals to emerge as a consequence of cognitive and moral operations at multiple levels of analysis. You can have some goals, but your goals will be modified by your familial goals, and those will be modified by social goals. So there has to be a balance between the systems that you're involved in that set goals in order for you to be able to pursue any with any degree of emotional stability. And so the balancing issue is very important too. It's not only that you pursue goals, it's that the goals you pursue have to be of the type, for example, that also allow other people to pursue their goals. And that makes the goals that you're allowed to pursue of a very special sort. And we know this, if you know anything about, the idea of philosophy of human rights. You have your rights end where mine begin. What does that mean? You can set your goals and I can set mine. And if there's a conflict, well, then we have to negotiate. There's something we have to do. All of English common law, by the way, is a consequence of precisely that negotiation. Because the initial hypothesis is you have all the rights there are and so do I, but when we clash, there has to be a superordinate determination of goal priority. And that's English common law. So and that relates to that idea of Piaget's I talked about earlier, because Piaget thought about an ideal state as one where goal pursuits were equilibrated. So imagine that, maybe you're really good at reading and I'm really good at writing, and so we decide to collaborate on a paper. Well, that's great. That's an equilibrated state because you get to pursue your goals. You're really good at them. Wonderful. I get to pursue mine. I'm really good at them. We throw that together in a collaborative pursuit, which means we subordinate our goal seeking to a higher order goal, and the higher order goal gets accomplished, and so do both our goals. Yes. Perfect. And that's called an equilibrated state. And when I talked about the idea that science might be able to start to understand idealized goal structures using this Piagetian approach, the Piagetian approach basically assumes that as we mature and become increasingly social, our internal singular goal-directed systems start to cooperate under the influence of the cortex, essentially. And then once that's happened and there's integration to some degree inside, then we can start integrating our higher order integrated goal structures with those of other people. And we keep doing that over longer and longer time frames and including more and more people. And there's a balance there. And that balance is an equilibrated state. And if you operate in keeping with that balance, then you're mentally healthy. Now, it's a bit more complicated than that, but it's not a bad start. It's a brilliant idea.